Chapter 5. That afternoon, a drum message came in from the north. Pemer was in the main room, diligently copying drum measures that Dearson had set him to learn by evening, although he already knew them off by rhythm perfect. He translated the message as it throbbed in. Urgent. Reply required, please. Nobol. To himself, Pemer smiled as the rest of the message pounded on, because he had the sudden suspicion that the Nobol drummer had begun with those measures to soften the arrogance of the main message. Lord Moran of Nobol demands the immediate appearance of Master Oldive. Reply instantly. Had the drummer added grave illness, the signal urgent would have been appropriate. Pemer continued his copying smoothly, aware of the eyes of the other apprentices on him. Let them think that he understood little beyond the first 3 measures, which was about all they'd know. Rucaius, the journeyman on duty, came into the room a moment later. Who's running messages today? He asked, the thin, folded sheaf of the transcribed message in his hand. The others all pointed to Pemer, who immediately put his pen down and rose to his feet. The journeyman frowned. You were on yesterday. I'm on again today, Rucaius, said Pemer cheerfully and reached for the sheaf. Seems to me you're always on, Rucaius said, holding the message away from Pemer as he glared suspiciously at the others. Dearson said I was messenger until he said otherwise, said Pemer, shrugging as if it were a matter of indifference to him. All right, then. And the journeyman surrendered the message, still eyeing the other 4 boys. But it seems queer to me you're always running. I'm newest, said Pemer, and left the room. He was rather pleased that Rucaius had noticed. Actually, he didn't mind, because he got a brief respite from the sour presence of the other apprentices. He dashed down the 3 flights of steps in his usual fashion, one hand lightly on the stone rail, plummeting down as fast as he could go. He burst out into the courtyard, automatically glancing about. The raking team was at work. He waved cheerfully to the section leader and then took the main steps to the hall 3 at a time. His legs must be getting longer, he thought, or he was improving his stride, because he used to be able to leap only 2. Slightly puffed, he tapped politely at Master Oldive's door and handed over the message, wheeling instantly so that no one could say he'd seen the message. Hold a moment, young Pemer, said Master Oldive, unfolding the sheaf and frowning as he read its contents. Urgent, is it? Well, it could be at that. Though why they wouldn't in courtesy send their watch dragon. Oh well, Nobol hasn't one, has it? Reply that I'll come. And please ask Master Olodki to pass the word to Teledon that I must prevail on his good nature for passage to Nobol. I shall go straight to the meadow to wait for him. Pemer repeated the message, using Master Oldive's exact phrasing and intonation. Released by the healer, he sped back across the court with another wave to the section leader. He was halfway up the 2nd flight when he felt his right foot slide on the stone. He tried to catch himself, but his forward motion and the stretch of his legs were such that he hadn't a hope of saving himself from a fall. He tried to grab the stone railing with his right hand, but it, too, was slick. He was thrown hard against the stone risers, wrenching thighs and hips, cracking his ribs painfully as he slid. He could have sworn that he heard a muffled laugh. His last conscious thought as his chin hit the stone and he bit his tongue hard was that someone had greased the rail and steps.
I used grease.
His shoulder was roughly shaken, and he heard Dearson's irritated command to wake up. What are you doing here? Why didn't you return immediately with Master Oldive's request? He's been waiting in the meadow. You can't even be trusted to run messages. Pemer tried to form an excuse, but only a groan issued from his lips as he groggily tried to right himself. He was dimly conscious of aches and pains all over his left side and sore stiffness across his cheek and under his chin. Fell on the steps, did you? Knocked yourself out, huh? Dearson was unsympathetic, but he was less rough-handed as he helped Pemer turn and sit on the bottom step. Greased, Pemer mumbled, waving with one hand at the steps while the other he cushioned his aching head to reduce the pounding in his skull. But every place he touched his head seemed to ache too, and the agony was making him ill to his stomach. Greased? Greased? Dearson exclaimed in acid disbelief. A likely notion. You're always pelting up and down these steps. It's a wonder you haven't hurt yourself before now. Can't you get up? Pemer started to shake his head, but the slightest motion made him feel sick to his stomach. If he had to spew in front of Dearson, he'd be doubly humiliated, and if he tried to move, he knew he would be ill. You said it was greased? Dearson's voice came from above his head. The agitated tone hurt Peemer's skull. Step there. In the handrail. Peemer gestured with one hand. There's not a sign of grease. On your feet! Dearzen sounded angrier than ever. Did you find him, Dearzen? Rukias called. The voice of the duty journeyman made Peemer's head throb like a message drum. What happened to him? He fell down the steps and knocked himself between. Dearzen was thoroughly disgusted. Get up, Peemer! No, Peemer. Stay where you are, said Rukias, and his voice was unexpectedly concerned. I'm sorry. Do you need to go outside right now? Excuse me.
Stop.
Peemer wished he wouldn't shout, but he was very willing to stay where he was. The nausea in his belly seemed to be echoed by his head, and he didn't dare so much as open his eyes. Things whirled even with them shut. He said it was greased. Feel it yourself, Rukias. Clean as a drum. Too clean. And if Peemer fell on his way back, he was between a long time. Too long for a mere slip. We'd better get him to Sylvina. To Sylvina? Why bother her for a little tumble? He's only skinned his chin. Rukias' hands were gently pressing against his skull and neck, then his arms and legs. He couldn't suppress a yelp when a particularly painful bruise was touched. This wasn't a little tumble, Dearzen. I know you don't like the boy, but any fool could see he's hurt. Can you stand, Peemer? Peemer groaned, which was all he dared to do, or his dinner would come up. He's faking to get out of duty, Dearzen said. He's not faking, Dearzen. And another thing, he's done too much of the running. Clell and the others haven't moved their butts out of the drum heights the last 7 days I've been on duty. Peemer's the newest. You know the rule. Oh, leave off, Dearzen, and take him from the other side. I want to carry him as flat as possible. With Dearzen's grudging assistance, they carried him down the stairs, Peemer fighting against his nausea. He was only dazedly aware that Rukias was shouting for someone to fetch Sylvina and be quick. They were maneuvering him up the stairs to the main hall, towards the infirmary, when Sylvina intercepted them, asking quick questions to which she got simultaneous answers from Dearzen and Rukias. He fell down the stairs, said Rukias. Nothing but a tumble, said Dearzen, overriding the other man. Kept Master Oldive standing in the meadow. Sylvina's hands felt cool on his face, moved gently over his skull. He knocked himself between Sylvina, probably for a good 20 minutes or more, Rukias was saying, his urgent tone cutting through Dearzen's petulant complaint. He claimed there was grease. There was grease, said Sylvina. Look at his right shoe, Dearzen. Peemer, do you feel nauseated? Peemer made an affirmative sound, hoping that he could suppress the urge to spew until he was in the infirmary, even as a small spark of irreverence suggested that here was a superb opportunity to get back at Dearzen with no possible repercussions. He's jarred his skull, all right. Smart of you to carry him prone, Rukias. Here now, set him down on this bed. No, you fool, don't sit him up! The tipping of his body upward triggered the nausea, and Peemer spewed violently onto the floor. Miserable at such a lack of control, Peemer was also powerless to prevent the heaving that shook him. Then he felt Sylvina's hand supporting his head. He was aware that a basin was appropriately in position. Sylvina spoke in a soothing tone, half supporting his trembling body as he continued to vomit. He was thoroughly exhausted and trembling when the spasms ended and he was eased back against a pile of pillows and could rest his aching head. I take it that Master Oldive has already gone off to Nabol. How did you know where he went? Demanded Dearzen, irritably astonished. You are a proper idiot, Dearzen. I haven't lived in the Harper Hall all my life without being able to understand drum messages quite well. Not to worry, she said, and now her fingertips were delicately measuring Peemer's skull inch by inch. I can't feel a crack or split. He may have done no more than rattle his brains. Rest, quiet, and time will cure that thumping. Yes, Master Robinson? Sylvina's hands paused as she tucked the sleeping fur about Peemer's chin. Peemer's been hurt? The Harper's voice was anxious. As Peemer turned to one elbow to acknowledge the Harper's entrance, Sylvina's hands forced him back against the piled pillows. Not seriously, I'm relieved to say, but let's all leave the room. I'd like a word with these journeymen in your presence, Master Robinson. The door closed, and Peemer fought between the overwhelming desire to sleep and curiosity about what she had to say to Dearzen and Rukias in front of the Master Harper. Sleep conquered. Once she'd closed the door, Sylvina gave vent to the anger she'd held in since she'd first glimpsed the gray pallor of Peemer's face and heard Dearzen's nasal complaints. "How could you let matters get so out of hand, Dearzen?" she demanded, whirling on the astonished journeyman. "What sort of prank is that for apprentices to try on anyone? Peemer's not been himself, but I put that down to losing his voice and adjusting to the disappointment over the music. But this is criminal!" Sylvina brandished Peemer's begreased boot at Dearzen, backing the astonished journeyman against the wall. Oblivious to Master Robinton's repeated query about Peemer's condition, to Manoli's precipitous arrival, her face flushed and furrowed with anxiety, and to Rucaius's delighted and amused observation. "Enough, Sylvina!" The Master Harper's voice was loud enough to quell her momentarily, but she turned to him with an injunction to keep his voice down. "Please." "I will," said the Harper in a moderate tone, keeping Sylvina turned toward him and away from the subject of her ire, "if you will tell me what happened to Peemer." Sylvina let out an exasperated breath, glared once more at Dearzen, and then answered Master Robinton. "His skull isn't cracked, though how it wasn't I'll never know." And she exhibited the glistening sole of Peemer's boot, with stair treads coated with grease. "He's bruised, scraped, and shaken, and he's definitely suffering from shock and concussion." "When will he recover?" There was an urgency behind the Harper's voice that Sylvina heard. Now she gave him a long, keen look. "A few days' rest will see him right, I'm sure. But I mean rest." She crossed her hands in a whipping motion to emphasize her verdict, then pointed to the closed infirmary door. "Right there! Nowhere near those murdering louts in the Drum Heights." "Murdering?" Dearzen gasped in objection to her term. "He could have been killed. You know how Peemer climbs steps," she said, scowling fiercely at the journeyman. But there wasn't a trace of grease on those steps or the railing. I tested them all myself." "Too clean," said Rucaius, and earned a reprimanding glare from Dearzen. "Too clean," Rucaius repeated, and then said to Sylvina, Peemer's a decidedly odd man. He learns too quickly." "And spouts off what he hears." Dearzen spoke sharply, determined that Peemer should share the responsibility for this untoward incident. "Not Peemer," Sylvina and Manoli said in one breath. Dearzen sputtered for a moment. "But there have been several very private messages that were all over the hall. And everyone knows how much Peemer talks, what a conniver he is." "Conniver, yes," said Sylvina, just as Manoli drew breath to defend herself. "Blabberer, no. He's not been saying more than please and thank you lately either, I'd noticed. And I've noticed some other things happening to him that ought not to have. No mere pranks for the new lad in the craft, either." Dearzen moved uneasily under her intense stare and looked appealingly toward the Master Harper. "How much of drum messages has Peemer learned in his time with you?" asked the Harper, no expression in voice or face other than polite inquiry. "Well now, he does seem to have picked up every measure I've set him. In fact," and Dearzen admitted this reluctantly, "he has quite a knack for it. Though of course he's not done more than beat the woods or listen with the journeyman on duty." He glanced at Rucaius for support. "I'd say Peemer knows more than he admits," said Rucaius in a droll tone, grinning when Dearzen began to mouth a denial. "It'd be like Peemer," said Manoli with a grin, and then touching Sylvina's arm, "Does he need someone with him right now?" "Rest and quiet is what he needs, and I'll look in on him every little while." "Rocky could stay," Manoli said. The little bronze fire lizard put in an immediate appearance, chittering worriedly to find himself in such an unexpected place. "I won't deny that would be sensible," said Sylvina, glancing at the closed door. "Yes, that would be very wise, I think." Everyone watched as Manoli, stroking Rocky gently, told him that he should stay with Peemer and let her know when he spoke. Then she opened the door just enough to admit the little fire lizard, watching as Rocky settled himself quietly by Peemer's feet, his glistening eyes on the boy's pale face. "Rucaius, would you help Manoli collect Peemer's things from the Drum Heights?" asked the Harper. His voice was mild, his manner unexceptionable, but unmistakably his attitude informed Dearzen that he had misjudged Peemer's standing in the eyes of the most important people in the hall. Dearzen offered to do the small task himself, and was denied, offered to help Manoli, who awarded him with a cool look. He desisted then, but the set look to his mouth and the controlled anger in his eyes suggested that he was going to deal sternly with the apprentices who had put him in such an invidious position. When he was unexpectedly placed on duty for the entire feast day, he knew why the roster had been changed. He also knew better than to blame Pemer. Once Manoli and the journeyman had left them, Robinson turned again to Sylvina, showing all the anxiety and concern he had kept hidden. "Now don't you worry, Robinson," Sylvina said, patting him on the arm. "He's had a frightful knock on his skull, but I could feel no crack. Those scrapes on chin and cheek'll mend. He'll be stiff and sore from the bruising, that's certain. If you'd only asked me," and Sylvina's manner indicated that she'd have her say at any road, "I'd have said there were much better uses for Pemer than message drumming. He's been a changed lad since he went to the Heights. Not a peep of complaint out of him, but it's as if he wouldn't speak for fear of saying something that was the least bit out of line. And then Dearson has the nerve to say that Pemer babbled drum messages." They were at the harper's quarters now, and Sylvina waited until they were within before she had her final word. "And don't I know what he'd never whisper?" "And what would that be?" Robinson eyed her with wry amusement. "That he brought the master's stones down from the mine. And something else happened that day to keep him overnight, which I haven't discovered as yet," she added, with a sigh of regret as she seated herself. Robinson laughed then, rubbing his fingers gently on her cheek before he came round the table and poured wine, looking at her as he suspended the wineskin above a second glass. She nodded agreement. She needed the wine after the excitement and worry over Pemer, and with the little bronze watching the boys, she didn't need to hurry back. "The whole accident is my fault," said the harper after a long sip of wine. He seated himself heavily. "Pemer is clever, and he can keep his tongue still. Too still for his own good health, I see now. He hasn't hinted of any trouble in the drum heights either to Manoli or Sibel. They'd be the last he'd tell, except for yourself, of course." Sylvina gave a snort. "I only knew about it after the impression at Bendon. The others," and Sylvina wrinkled her nose in remembered distaste, "treated his new clothes. I came upon him washing them, or I'd never have known either." She chuckled with such malice the harper had no trouble following her thought. "They did it while he was at Egan Hole, not knowing about the impression?" He joined in her laughter, and Sylvina knew that she'd restored his perspective on the unfortunate affair. "And to think that I placed him in the drum heights to safeguard him. You're sure he sustained no lasting hurt?" "As sure as I could be without Master Oldive to confirm it." Sylvina spoke tartly, for Master Oldive's attendance on that worthless Lord of Nabol when he was urgently needed in the hall aggravated her intensely. "Yes, Maron." The Master Harper sighed again, one corner of his expressive mouth twitching with irritation and an inner perplexity. "The man's dying. Not all of Master Oldive's skill can save him. And why bother with Maron? He's better dead after all the harm he's done. When I think that Brecky's queen might still be alive today." "It's his dying that will cause even more trouble, Sylvina." "How? We could no more have Nabol hold in contention than we can have Ruatha hold. But Nabol has half a dozen heirs of full blood. Maron won't name his successor." "Oh." Sylvina's exclamation of startled comprehension was followed quickly by a second of utter disgust. What more could you expect of that man? But surely steps can be taken. I doubt that Master Oldive would scruple against." Master Robinson held up his hand. "Nabol has been cursed with holders either too ambitious, too selfish, or too incompetent to render it in any way prosperous. To be sure, it's not the best of holds, stuck in the mountains. Cold, damp, harsh. Quite right. So there's little sense in forcing combat on the full-blooded heirs when one might just end up with another unsympathetic and uncooperative lord." Sylvina narrowed her eyes in thought.
I have questions.
"Can it wait till after we're done reading? I have one page left."
I'm very confused, but yes.
Okay. Sylvina narrowed her eyes in thought. "I make it 9 or 10 full-blooded close male heirs. Those daughters of Maron's are too young to be married, and none of them will ever be pretty, taking after their sire, as they all seem to have had the misfortune to do. Which of those 9, 10, which would get the most support from the small holders and craft halls? And how, pray tell, does Pemer fit into—" "Oh, but of course." A smile smoothed Sylvina's frown, and she raised her glass to toast the harbor's ingenuity. He did well, then, at Egan Hold. Indeed he did, though Egan's a loyal group under any circumstances.
Wait, what did Peter do again?
Listened at the gather. Sylvina caught his slight emphasis on the word loyal and scrutinized his thoughtful face. Why loyal? And to whom? Surely there's no more disloyalty to Benton. Robinson gave a quick negative shake of his head. Several disquieting rumors have come to my notice. The most worrying, the fact that Nabole abounds with fire lizards. Nabole has no shoreline, and scarcely any friends in holds that do acquire what fire lizards have found. Robinson agreed. They have also been ordering and paying for large quantities of fine cloth, wines, the delicacies of Nerat, Tillich, and Caroon, not to mention every sort of mongery from the Smithcraft Hall that can be bought or bartered. Quantities and qualities enough to garb, feed, and supply amply every holder, caught, and hold in Nabole. And don't. The old-timers. Sylvina emphasized that guess with a snap of her fingers. Takul and Moran were always 2 cuts from the same rib. What I cannot figure out is what besides fire lizards the association gains Moran. You can't? Sylvina was frankly skeptical. Spite, malice, scoring off Benton. Robinson reflected on that opinion, turning his wineglass idly by the stems. I'd like to know. Yes, you would. Sylvina grinned at him, tolerance for his foibles as well as affection in her glance. You and Pemer are paired in that respect. He has the same insatiable urge to know, and he's a dab hand at finding out, too. Is that why you want his head mended? You're sending him up to Candler at Nabole Hold? No. And the harper drawled the word, pulling at his lower lip. No, not directly to Nabole Hold. Moran might recognize him. The man's never been a fool, just perverted in principle. Just. Sylvina was disgusted. I'd like to know what's going on there. Today's not likely to be the last time Moran suggests summoning Master Olddive, she said, raising her eyebrows suggestively. Robinson brushed aside the notion. I hear that a gather's been scheduled at Nabole on the same 7 day as Lord Groke's. Isn't that just like Moran? Consequently, no one would expect hall harpers to be in attendance, and Robinson ended his sentence on an upswing of tone, eyeing Sylvina hopefully. The boy'll be fit enough for a gather, and undoubtedly it's kinder to send him away from the hall on that particular day. Tilgan's come along amazingly. Could he do aught else? Asked Robinson with real humor in his voice, with both Schonager and Domick spending every waking moment with him.